Fuller says good morning. We're in chapter 3, and they're at the church service, and can't remember which child's mother plays piano, but he was really proud of his mom playing piano, and there were all these ministers at church, and then he got into just a tiny bit of trouble with his dad because he started giggling when he looked at circus or poetry. Okay. But let me tell you about the important thing that happened that night. The church service kept right on going, the band, choir music, solos, quartets, and an interesting sermon. When I first started praying for Circus's dad, I sort of expected God to answer my prayer right away. Anyway, in a week or two. I didn't realize then that a person needs to have the Word of God given to them first. And then Jesus can enter their hearts, and the Holy Spirit can enter their hearts at that time. And besides, God just doesn't come to a man's heart and batter it open to get in. We plant the mustard seed first. So I decided that if I had to wait a long time, I would, but I would keep right on praying. Anyway, the minister who preached that night talked about the home, and I was sure Circus's dad was outside somewhere listening, but I certainly didn't expect him to be much interested, and that's why I was so surprised when my prayer was answered. Every now and then during the sermon, I glanced over to Circus to see how he liked it, but I didn't need to worry about him not liking it. He was listening for all he was worth. Good old Circus with his monkey face and his strong athletic body and his brown hair combed nice and straight. He'd even cleaned his fingernails and washed his neck and ears, which I knew he didn't like to do. There he was, sitting up straight, listening with shining eyes, in spite of knowing that as soon as the meeting was over, he'd have to go home to a weathered old house with the poor furniture, worn-out rugs on the floor, and a swearing and drinking father who didn't like him. I remembered the time about a month ago when Circus's dad had been drunk on the same night when they had a new baby in their house. Circus had stayed all night at my house. He and I were upstairs undressing, and he got tears in his eyes and doubled up his fists and looked terribly fierce because he was so mad at the people who made and sold beer and whiskey. And that was the night he had said, his voice all trembly, "I wish they'd just went to take a picture of my dad when he's drunk and put that in their newspapers and magazines. I bet that wouldn't make anyone want to buy any." Well, pretty soon the sermon was over, and the minister announced that there would be a short prayer in a curtained-off area of the tent, beginning right away. He said he'd like all the Sunday school teachers to go into the little room while everyone was singing the last song, "Just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me." And then the minister said in his big, kind voice, "No doubt there are many tonight who feel the Spirit talking to you. Would you come forward and let us explain to you from the Bible exactly what being a Christian is all about? And if there are any of your friends who wish to come with you, they may feel free to do so." Now, maybe those aren't the exact words he used, but it was something like that. I thought it would be nice to say it, and I knew somebody would go. A person couldn't hear a sermon like that and not want to. Well, everyone was standing and singing, and because my dad was a Sunday school teacher, he handed Charlotte Ann over to Mom and started down the grassy aisle toward the little curtained-off area in the tent, carrying his Bible with him, which he always took to church anyway. Well, pretty soon, people were talking and praying, and little Jim's mom played, and the choir and everyone was singing, even the people in the band, because the band never played during what they called this prayer time. I looked over at little Jim, and he was standing with tears in his eyes, his hands gripping the back of the seat in front of him. So I leaned over to little Jim and said, "What's the matter, Jim?" He gulped, his voice choked as he whispered, "Circus, I want Jesus to become real to him tonight." I couldn't stand to see little Jim's tears. It was kind of like our old iron pitcher pump back home when it runs down. You have to pour water in the top, and then if you pump real hard for a moment, the water will come and you'll pump gallons and gallons. It's called priming. Well, little Jim's tears primed mine, and before I knew it, a tear had tumbled out of my eyes and splashed right down in the hymn book I was holding. I gulped and started singing as hard as I could, looking straight ahead of me. And while I looked, it seemed the minister and the choir in the tent faded, and I could see a little leather book tucked away in a crack in a log up in the corner of our haymow. Just that minute, there was a rustling beside me, and I knew that somebody from our row was trying to get out into the aisle. I looked quickly to see who it was, and it was Circus. In a jiffy, he was gone, and all I could see was the top of his square shoulders and the top of his brown hair as he hurried off down the aisle to visit with my dad. The minister saw him coming and stepped down off the platform to shake his hand with him before letting him go talk to my dad. Then the minister's kind voice said to all of us, "I'd rather like to see a fine boy like this become a Christian than anyone else in the whole world." And then it happened. It happened so quick I could hardly believe my eyes. Someone else was hurrying down the aisle right past us, running, in fact crying, saying, "That's my boy! That's my boy! I want to know Jesus too." And it was Circus's dad. He threw his arms around Circus and they went into the little room together. I was glad that my dad was already there. I knew that he knew the Bible well enough to show Circus's dad how to be saved. Although the ministers there had been on the platform, we're all there too. It was great. And right at that moment, I decided something. When I grew up and became a doctor, I wasn't only going to be a good doctor, but I was going to be a saved doctor who knew how to tell other people about Jesus the way my dad did. When we had gone home and the car was in the garage, I asked my dad for his flashlight. "What for?" he asked. "Oh, 'cause I want to go outdoors for a while." He looked at me and started to say no and then changed his mind. So with the flashlight in my hand, I went across to the barnyard, to our barn door, opened it and went inside. There was old Mixie, our black and white cat, mewing on a log, and I could hear the crunch crunch of the horses' teeth as they ate their hay. Then I climbed the wooden ladder into the haymow. I didn't stay there long, but when I came down, I had my New Testament in my hip pocket. At the foot of the ladder, I scooped up Mixie and hugged her and said, "Mixie, you're the nicest, prettiest cat in all the world. All the whole wide world." I carried her in my arms all the way across the barnyard to the house, and then I let her down carefully and went in and upstairs to bed. I'd forgotten all about the bear, and I didn't think about her all again until the next morning, which seemed to come almost right away. Chapter 4. I hoed potatoes in our garden all that morning, which was even hotter than it had been the day before. That is, I hoed between doing errands for Mom and Dad. First I hoed potatoes, then I picked a kettle of long green beans for Mom because we were going to have pork and beans for dinner. You know, hungry boys and hungry bears like pork. Then I hoed potatoes and took care of Charlotte Ann, and hoed potatoes and carried a drink of water to Dad, who was out in the field plowing corn. Then I hoed potatoes. About 10 o'clock, I went over to Poetry's house to take a note to his mother. You see, the women of our church were having some kind of a missionary meeting at our house in the afternoon. Poetry's telephone was out of order, and Mom wanted Mrs. Thompson to bring something for lunch. Sandwiches, I think. I didn't feel at all sad about leaving those potatoes, although I knew I'd have to finish them sometime. Still, there's something fascinating about cutting out ugly little weeds and loosening the rich brown soil and pulling it all up around potato plants. I think it was that my mind was on the bear and a lot of other things that made me especially glad when I was asked to go to Poetry's house. "May I stay a little while and play?" I asked. "I'm sorry," Mom said, "not this morning. I have a lot of errands for you, so hurry right back." Then she saw how disappointed I was, so she said, "Well," 30 minutes and no longer. I jumped on my bicycle and pedaled down the road as fast as I could to Poetry's. I had to pass Little Jim's house on the way, so I stopped for a minute to rest in the shade of the big cottonwood tree near their front gate. It was Little Jim's piano practice time, and I could hear him going over and over a certain hard piece of music. I felt sorry for him having to practice on such a hot day, but I knew he was learning something. And you'll never be anybody worthwhile in this world unless you stick to something and work hard, whether you want to or not. Just as I started to go on to Poetry's house, Little Jim's mother came to their front door and called, "Good morning, Bill." "Good morning, Mrs. Foote," I said, and I tipped my straw hat. A boy would feel like tipping his hat to Little Jim's mother, even if he didn't know it was the right etiquette to tip his hat whenever a lady speaks to him. She was just that kind of woman. Just that minute, Little Jim began to play one of the church hymns, and it was "Just As I Am." Pretty soon I was at Poetry's. I gave the note to his mother, and she thanked me. And the very first thing she did was make me sit down and eat a big piece of warm blackberry pie, which she had just baked. That sounds rough. Poetry's mother wasn't small and pretty like Little Jim's mother, and she had big hands and feet, but she had a good mother face, and she liked boys. Poetry came in from their blackberry bush in time to eat a piece of cake, too. Then I went out with him and helped him until we had picked a 2-gallon bucket of luscious blackberries, each of us maybe eating a half a pint of berries while we were picking. "Do you know that bears like blackberries?" I asked Poetry, and then I let out a low, fierce growl right behind him and grabbed him by the foot and got kicked in the chin as a reward for scaring him. We'd have had a real scuffle if there hadn't been so many briars around. And that started us telling about bears, and I told him what my dad had said about some of our pigs being gone. We just talked and felt scared and brave at the same time, saying what we'd do if a bear came shuffling along right that minute. "I'd throw this pail full of berries at him," Poetry said, "and then I'd run, and he'd stop and eat the berries, 'cause bears like blackberries better than barefoot boys." He grinned at all the letter B's he'd used. And then he started, "Blessings on thee, little man, barefoot boy with cheek of tan, with thy turned up pantaloons and thy merry whistled tunes." "Do you suppose what you found yesterday was from a real bear?" I asked. "Nah, it was rabbit's fur. I was just fooling." Well, it began to look as if the idea of a bear being in our neighborhood was crazy, so we started talking about something else. Although I still believe there might be one, and I made up my mind to find out. Maybe the gang could go down along the swamp that very afternoon, I thought. We'd planned to go swimming at 2 o'clock if we could. And do you know, I forgot all about not staying longer than a half hour. I know that's no excuse, but I did forget, and I didn't do it on purpose. After we'd given the pail of berries to his mother, we went out to his tent under the big maple tree. "There's something I want to show you," said Poetry. I'd mentioned before that all the gang were collecting shells that summer. Well, Circus had maybe the best collection of us all, except Little Jim. Of course, there wasn't a large variety of shells to be found along Sugar Creek, but we had relatives who lived in different places, and they sent us shells. Poetry had an orange scallop, 2.5 inches high, and a reddish-brown scallop, 6 inches high, which his uncle had sent him from the Atlantic Ocean, and a knobbed whelp, which is shaped like a pear from Texas, and a little moon shell, and a periwinkle. And I got interrupted. Time is up.